August 22, 1917, 4:40 a.m. near St. Julien, Belgium. The metallic groan of steel tracks grinding through Flanders mud couldn't mask Captain Donald Richardson's rapid breathing as he peered through the narrow vision slit of tank F-41 Mark IV number 2329. In the suffocating darkness of the armored beast, 8 men sat surrounded by the deafening roar of the 105-horsepower Daimler engine, unaware they were about to experience the longest tank action in the history of the Great War. Second Lieutenant George Hill, crouched at the forward gun position, adjusted his goggles against the engine heat that already reached 30 degrees Celsius. The air inside tasted of oil, cordite, and fear. Behind them, Sergeant Robert Francis Missen checked his 6-pounder gun for the 3rd time, his hands steady despite knowing what awaited them in the gray dawn ahead. Outside, German machine gunners at Somme Farm were already tracking the lumbering silhouette emerging from the British lines like a prehistoric monster crawling from its lair. What none of them knew, not the British crew inside their steel coffin, not the German defenders watching in disbelief, not the infantry officers coordinating the attack, was that this grotesque metal box, named after a brand of canned beef, would become a tomb, a fortress, and a legend all within the next 72 hours. Within 3 days, 1 man would be dead, 7 would be wounded, and the survivors would become the most decorated tank crew of World War I. But first, they had to survive the mud. Then the Germans. Then their own artillery. This is the story of how industrial warfare's newest weapon became a death trap that refused to kill. How 8 ordinary men armed with pistols and rifles held off an entire German regiment for 3 days, and how the British Mark IV tank, mocked as a mechanical failure by both sides, proved that armor and courage could triumph over impossible odds. The British Mark IV tank had emerged from desperate innovation. After 2 years of static trench warfare that had consumed a generation, British military planners sought a weapon that could break the stalemate. What they created was something the world had never seen, a land ship designed to crush barbed wire, cross trenches, and terrorize infantry. The Mark IV, introduced in April 1917, represented the 3rd generation of British tank design. At 28 tons fully loaded, it stretched 26 feet long and 8 feet wide. The rhomboidal shape, with tracks running around the entire hull perimeter, allowed it to cross trenches up to 10 feet wide, a feat no other vehicle could accomplish. The male variant, like Fray Bentos, carried 2 QF 6-pounder guns, 1 in each sponson, the armored bulges protruding from either side. These 57mm naval guns, firing high-explosive and armor-piercing shells, could destroy German machine gun nests and concrete bunkers at 300 yards. 3 Lewis machine guns, .303 caliber, provided close defense. The armor plating ranged from 6mm to 12mm thick, enough to stop rifle fire and shell fragments, but vulnerable to armor-piercing bullets and the new German K-bullets specifically designed to penetrate tank armor. Inside, the crew operated in conditions that can only be described as hellish. The Daimler sleeve valve engine, adapted from luxury automotives, produced 105 horsepower but generated heat that turned the crew compartment into an oven. Temperatures regularly exceeded 30 degrees Celsius, while carbon monoxide from the engine and cordite fumes from the guns created a toxic atmosphere that required frequent ventilation stops. The noise was indescribable. Engine roar, track clatter, and gun blast combined into a 110 decibel cacophony that made verbal communication impossible. Crew members used hand signals and written notes to coordinate. Many suffered permanent hearing damage after just a few missions. But the worst aspect of tank warfare was the vulnerability. Despite weighing 28 tons, the Mark IV could be disabled by a lucky shell, destroyed by a direct hit from artillery, or immobilized by mechanical failure. Training accidents killed more tank crew members than enemy action in early 1917. The Tank Corps, established in July 1917, was viewed with skepticism by traditional military officers. Many senior commanders considered tanks unreliable novelties, expensive toys that would never replace cavalry or artillery. At the Battle of Arras in April 1917, 60 tanks were deployed, but only 24 reached their objectives. The rest broke down, ditched, or were destroyed. German soldiers initially feared the tanks as demons, but quickly learned their weaknesses. A well-placed grenade in the tracks could immobilize them. Artillery could blow them apart. K-bullets could punch through the armor, killing crew inside. Most dangerously, tanks moved at walking pace, about 4 miles per hour on good ground. In the Flanders mud, they slowed to a crawl, making them easy targets for German gunners. The Third Battle of Ypres, known to history as Passchendaele, had begun on July 31, 1917. Field Marshal Douglas Haig's plan was to break through German lines in Belgium, capture the ridges around Ypres, and push toward the occupied Channel ports. The offensive immediately became a nightmare. Preliminary bombardment had destroyed drainage systems in the low-lying Flanders plain. Unprecedented rainfall turned the battlefield into a swamp. Men drowned in shell holes filled with water. Horses sank to their bellies in liquid mud, and tanks, weighing 28 tons, became trapped with terrifying ease. By August 22nd, the British had advanced less than 2 miles in 3 weeks, suffering 75,000 casualties for minimal territorial gain. The German defense system, built on higher ground, consisted of concrete pillboxes, machine gun positions, and barbed wire belts up to 100 yards deep in places. Every farm, every ruined building, every shell hole was a fortified position. The 61st Division, South Midland Division of the Territorial Force, was ordered to attack German positions near St. Julien on August 22nd. Their objective was to capture a network of German strongpoints, including Somme Farm, Gallipoli Farm, and Triangle Farm. 8 tanks from the Heavy Section Machine Gun Corps were assigned to support the attack. Fray Bentos was among them. Captain Donald Richardson was not a professional soldier. The 29-year-old was a wholesale grocer from Nottingham who had joined the war effort in 1914 with patriotic enthusiasm. His father, Arthur Richardson, was a Liberal Labour Member of Parliament, a pacifist who had voted against continuing the war in 1917. The irony that his son commanded a weapon of mechanized warfare was not lost on the family. Richardson had named his tank Fray Bentos after the popular brand of canned corned beef, a staple of British Army rations. The name was both practical and sardonic. Tanks were meant to break through German lines like opening a tin can. His crew was typical of the Tank Corps, working-class men from industrial cities, mechanics, factory workers, clerks. Second Lieutenant George Hill, 24, was the second in command. Sergeant Robert Francis Missen, service number 7869, was the senior NCO and gunner. Gunner William Morey, 6957, operated the left 6-pounder. Gunner Ernest Hayton, 6969, manned the right gun. Gunner Frederick Arthurs, 6943, handled the forward Lewis gun. Gunner Percy Edgar Budd, 6951, operated the rear Lewis gun. Gunner James Binley, 6964, served as loader and mechanic. Lance Corporal Ernest Hans Braedy, 6954, was the driver. These 8 men had trained together for 6 months, learning to operate as a single organism inside the steel beast. They had practiced gunnery, navigation, mechanical repairs, and emergency procedures, but nothing could prepare them for what awaited in the Flanders mud. At 4:40 a.m., under cover of darkness and artillery barrage, Richardson ordered his crew to advance. The Mark IV lurched forward, tracks churning through mud and shell-torn ground. Inside, the crew braced themselves against the violent pitching and rolling. Visibility was nearly zero. The narrow vision slits admitted little light, and the dawn was obscured by smoke and mist. Richardson navigated by compass and dead reckoning, hoping to maintain the correct bearing toward German lines 800 yards away. Within minutes, German machine guns at Somme Farm opened fire. Bullets struck the armor with metallic pings and ricochets that sounded like hail on a tin roof. Inside, the crew felt the impacts as vibrations through the hull. Sergeant Missen swung his 6-pounder toward the muzzle flashes, fired 2 rounds of high explosive, and silenced the German position. The Mark IV ground forward, crossing barbed wire that caught and snapped under its tracks. By 5:30 a.m., Fray Bentos had covered 600 yards. They were ahead of the infantry, deeper into German territory than planned. Richardson consulted his map by flashlight. They were approaching Gallipoli Farm, a fortified German strongpoint. At 5:45 a.m., disaster struck. The ground ahead looked firm, but it was deceptive. A shell crater filled with liquid mud, disguised by a thin crust. Lance Corporal Braedy, the driver, saw it too late. The Mark IV's right track dropped into the crater. At the same instant, a German machine gun at Gallipoli Farm opened fire. Bullets hammered the forward armor. One found a gap in the vision slit. Second Lieutenant George Hill jerked backward, blood spraying from his neck. He collapsed off his seat onto the slanted floor. Captain Richardson lunged forward to take his position, trying to reach the controls to correct the tank's attitude. But the Mark IV was already tilting sideways. 28 tons of steel tipping like a dying elephant into the shell crater. The crash was apocalyptic. Men were thrown against armor plate. Equipment flew through the crew compartment. Ammunition boxes broke loose. The engine shrieked as tracks spun uselessly. When the violence stopped, Fray Bentos lay on its right side, at a 45-degree angle, partially submerged in the crater, immobilized. Inside, the crew took stock of their situation. George Hill was conscious, but bleeding heavily from his neck wound. Gunner Percy Budd had been hit in the arm by the same burst of fire. Gunner William Morey had suffered a leg wound. The rest were shaken but mobile. Richardson immediately understood their predicament. They were trapped less than 50 yards from German positions, surrounded by enemy infantry, unable to move. The engine still ran, but with the right track buried in mud and the hull tilted at an impossible angle, they were not going anywhere. Standard procedure in this situation was to use the unditching beam, a massive wooden pole carried on the tank's roof. If they could attach it to the tracks with chains, the rotating tracks would push the beam under the hull, providing leverage to climb out. But attaching the beam required a man to go outside, into German machine gun fire at point-blank range. Sergeant Missen volunteered. He opened the right sponson door and crawled out onto the tilted hull. Instantly, German bullets struck the armor around him. He saw German infantry approximately 30 yards off, firing rifles and a machine gun. Missen scrambled back inside. "I heard bullets hitting the tank," he later recounted, "and saw some Boche about 30 yards off firing at me. I got in again." Lance Corporal Braedy tried from the left side. He managed to get the unditching beam chains attached to the track, but the exposed position made him an easy target. German machine gun fire concentrated on him. Braedy was hit multiple times and fell. Richardson watched helplessly as his driver died in the mud, unable to retrieve the body under the withering fire. He lost his life, Richardson wrote in his combat report, whilst fitting the unditching gear under terrific MG fire. The crew was now trapped, wounded, and under constant fire. But Fray Bentos could still fight. The 6-pounder guns, despite the tank's angle, could still traverse and fire. Missen and Hayton successfully engaged the machine guns at Gallipoli Farm, destroying 2 gun positions with direct hits. The Lewis guns raked German trenches, suppressing infantry attempts to rush the tank. For the next hour, Fray Bentos became a stationary fortress, pouring fire into German positions while absorbing punishment in return. Then, at approximately 7 a.m., the situation worsened. Through his vision slit, Richardson watched the British infantry fall back. The attack had failed. The 61st Division, unable to break through German defenses, was withdrawing to its starting positions. Fray Bentos was now alone in no man's land, surrounded by Germans, abandoned by the infantry it was meant to support. The Germans immediately recognized their opportunity. A disabled British tank, trapped and helpless. If they could capture it intact, German engineers could study its design, understand its weaknesses, develop countermeasures. German infantry began closing in from multiple directions. The crew of Fray Bentos opened fire with everything they had. The 6-pounders boomed, blasting high-explosive shells into advancing Germans. The Lewis guns chattered, sweeping trenches and shell holes. When Germans got too close for the main guns, the crew used their personal weapons, rifles and pistols, fired through vision slits and the driver's hatch. Sergeant Missen discovered that Germans were sheltering in a trench directly under the tank's forward hull, where the guns couldn't depress to hit them. The Boches were in an old trench close in under the front of the tank, Missen recalled, and we couldn't get the Lewis onto them owing to the angle of the tank, but we shot them easily with a rifle out of the revolver flap in the cab. The Germans tried multiple times to rush the tank. Each time, concentrated fire drove them back. Bodies began accumulating around Fray Bentos, German and British alike, dead from the fighting that morning. At approximately 10 p.m. that first night, the British fired illumination flares. The magnesium light turned night into ghostly day, revealing the landscape around Fray Bentos. What the crew saw froze their blood. German infantry were dug in on all sides, less than 50 yards away. Dozens of soldiers in trenches and shell holes surrounding the tank completely. They were an island in an ocean of enemies. Richardson gathered his men. Speaking in low voices to avoid being overheard by Germans outside, he outlined their options. We can try to escape tonight under cover of darkness. We can surrender and hope for mercy, or we can hold this position until relief arrives. The crew voted unanimously. They would fight. Inside the tank, conditions were deteriorating rapidly. The engine continued running to power the ventilation fans and electrical systems, but this created unbearable heat. The temperature inside exceeded 35 degrees Celsius. Combined with cordite smoke from the guns and carbon monoxide from the engine, the atmosphere became toxic. The wounded men suffered especially. Hill's neck wound continued bleeding despite field dressing. Bud's arm was broken and swelling. Maury's leg wound made movement inside the cramped space agonizing. They had medical supplies, but no morphine, no way to properly treat serious wounds. By mid-afternoon on August 22nd, the crew's situation was critical. They had been in combat for over 10 hours. Every man except James Binley had been wounded. Ammunition for the 6-pounders was running low. They had fired over 50 rounds between the two guns. The Lewis guns still had ammunition, but barrels were overheating. Most critically, they were out of drinking water. The crew's water bottles had been drained hours ago. In the furnace heat inside the tank, dehydration became as dangerous as German bullets. Gunner Hayton made a desperate suggestion. "The radiator! We can drink from the radiator!" Richardson hesitated. The water in the engine cooling system was contaminated with rust, oil, and antifreeze compounds. Drinking it could cause illness or poisoning, but dying of thirst was certain. He authorized it. Gunner Arthurs carefully drained water from the radiator into canteens. The liquid was brown, foul-tasting, warm, and metallic. The crew drank it anyway. It kept them alive, but several men suffered stomach cramps and nausea immediately. Then a new threat emerged. British artillery, unaware that Fray Bentos was still occupied, began targeting the disabled tank. Shells exploded around the hull, showering it with mud and shrapnel. British snipers, seeing movement through the vision slits and assuming the tank had been captured by Germans, began firing at it. Richardson realized they might be killed by their own side. Sergeant Missen volunteered for another suicide mission. "I'll go back and warn the infantry not to shoot us," he told Richardson, "as we should sooner or later have to clear out of the tank." At approximately 8:30 a.m., Missen crawled out the right sponson door. He lay flat against the hull, then rolled into a shell hole. From there, he crawled through 200 yards of no man's land, machine gun fire cracking over his head, shells exploding around him. It took him 45 minutes to reach British lines. When he finally tumbled into a British trench, soldiers stared in disbelief. His uniform was shredded, covered in mud and blood, but he delivered his message to the nearest officer. "Stop firing on the tank. The crew is still alive. Stop firing." The British sniping ceased, but the crew inside Fray Bentos couldn't risk showing themselves to signal Missen's success. Instead, they pushed a white rag through one of the portholes, a signal to both British and German forces that they surrendered. Except they had no intention of surrendering. The white flag was a ruse to stop British fire. When Germans approached, thinking the crew was giving up, they were met with a devastating volley from the 6-pounders and Lewis guns. This psychological warfare continued throughout the day. The Germans, unable to dislodge the crew by force, tried to wait them out. They knew the tank crew had limited ammunition, water, and medical supplies. Eventually, thirst, wounds, or exhaustion would force them to surrender or die. As evening approached, the Germans mounted another major assault. This time, they brought up a flamethrower team. Through the vision slits, Richardson saw German soldiers advancing with the distinctive backpack tanks and ignition wands of Flammenwerfers. If they got close enough to spray burning fuel through the vision slits or open hatches, the crew would be incinerated alive. Fray Bentos became a fortress of desperation. The 6-pounders fired their remaining high-explosive shells directly at the Flammenwerfer teams. One shell struck home. The German flamethrower fuel tank exploded in a massive fireball that consumed the operator and 2 nearby infantry. The horrific sight convinced other Germans to fall back. Night fell on August 22nd. The crew had been in action for 16 hours. Lance Corporal Braedy's body lay somewhere outside in the darkness. The 7 surviving crew members, all wounded except Binley, huddled in the tilted tank as temperatures plummeted. The same metal that had been an oven during the day became a refrigerator at night. Temperatures dropped near freezing. The wounded men shivered uncontrollably, unable to build a fire or use blankets they didn't have. August 23rd dawned with sporadic German probing attacks. Small groups of infantry would rush forward, testing the crew's alertness and ammunition reserves. Each time, the Lewis guns drove them back. But the attacks were wearing down the defenders. The crew was now into their 2nd day without sleep, exhausted, hungry, dehydrated, and in constant pain from their wounds. George Hill's condition was worsening. His neck wound had stopped bleeding, but infection was setting in. He was feverish and drifting in and out of consciousness. Percy Budd's broken arm was swelling grotesquely, turning purple and black from internal bleeding and lack of proper splinting. Around mid-morning, a German officer approached under a white flag. He stopped 20 yards from the tank and shouted in English, "British soldiers, you are surrounded. Surrender now and you will be treated with honor." Richardson ordered silence. No one responded. After a tense minute, the German officer shrugged and withdrew. 10 minutes later, German artillery opened fire. They were targeting the tank with indirect fire, trying to destroy it without risking more infantry. Shells exploded around Fray Bentos, showering it with mud, rocks, and shrapnel. One shell struck the left sponson directly. The explosion was deafening inside the crew compartment. Metal fragments punched through the armor in several places. Gunner Frederick Arthurs was hit by spalling, metal fragments torn from the inside of the armor. He screamed as red-hot metal tore through his shoulder. The crew now had 4 seriously wounded men in a space barely 10 feet by 8 feet. The stench of blood, sweat, oil, and cordite was overwhelming. Flies had found their way inside, attracted by the blood and the corpse of Braedy Abtfide. But still, they fought. When German infantry tried to advance behind the artillery barrage, the Lewis guns cut them down. The crew was down to their last 1,000 rounds of small arms ammunition, but they made every burst count. By afternoon of August 23rd, a strange stalemate had developed. The Germans couldn't capture the tank without suffering unacceptable casualties. The British crew couldn't escape without being killed. Both sides were locked in a battle of attrition, waiting to see who would break first. Richardson rationed their remaining supplies with mathematical precision. Each man received 2 sips of radiator water every 4 hours. Their food consisted of emergency iron rations, hard biscuits, and canned beef. The same Fray Bentos corned beef their tank was named after. The irony was not lost on the crew. That night, August 23rd into 24th, was the worst yet. The Germans, frustrated by their failure to capture or destroy the tank, maintained harassment fire throughout the night. Random bursts of machine gun fire, occasional artillery shells, anything to prevent the crew from resting. The psychological warfare was effective. The crew was now approaching 48 hours without sleep. Exhaustion playing tricks on their minds. Men saw movement in shadows that weren't there, heard voices calling for surrender, felt the tank walls closing in. James Binley, the only unwounded crew member, kept detailed notes in a small diary he carried. His entries from that night reveal the crew's mental state. Hill is bad, fever high, talking about his mother. Bud's arm looks like it might turn gangrenous. Captain keeps us together. Don't know how. We should all be dead. Can't remember what real food tastes like. Water from radiator making everyone sick. Germans are close. Can hear them talking. Think they're planning something big for tomorrow. August 24th dawned with fog, a thick Flanders mist that reduced visibility to 20 yards. The Germans used the cover to advance closer than ever. Richardson, peering through his vision slit, suddenly saw movement directly ahead. A German soldier was crawling toward the tank with a satchel charge, a bag full of explosives designed to blow the tank apart from underneath. The 6-pounders couldn't depress far enough to hit him. The Lewis guns had only a narrow firing arc. Richardson grabbed his service revolver, kicked open the driver's hatch, and fired 4 shots. The German dropped the satchel charge and retreated. Minutes later, a massive explosion rocked the ground near the tank. German engineers, unable to place the charge under Fray Bentos, had detonated it remotely, hoping the blast wave would damage the tank. The explosion created a new crater and showered the hull with debris, but the Mark IV's structure held. Throughout the morning, the Germans made repeated attempts to disable or destroy the tank. They tried concentrated rifle fire at the vision slits, hoping to kill the crew with lucky shots through the narrow openings. They brought up a captured British Lewis gun and fired at the sponsons, trying to penetrate the armor at close range. At one point, a German soldier actually climbed onto the tilted hull, trying to drop grenades through open hatches. Gunner Hayton saw him through a periscope, kicked open the top hatch, and threw the grenade back out. It exploded on the tank's exterior, injuring the German soldier who had dropped it. By noon on August 24th, the crew's ammunition situation was critical. They had fired their last 6-pounder shell hours earlier. The Lewis guns were down to approximately 300 rounds total. Each man had between 10 and 20 rounds left for their personal weapons. Richardson gathered the crew for what might be their final conference. "We have 3 options," he said quietly. "We can try to break out tonight. Some of us might make it. We can destroy the tank and surrender, denying it to the Germans. Or we stay until we run out of ammunition, then fight with our bare hands." The crew's response was immediate and unanimous. "We stay." Sergeant Missen spoke for all of them. "We've held this position for 2 days against an entire German regiment. We are not giving it up now. If we die here, we die knowing we did something they'll remember." Richardson nodded. "Then we fight until there's nothing left to fight with." That afternoon brought an unexpected development. British artillery began shelling German positions around the tank. Someone, perhaps Sergeant Missen during his escape, had reported Fray Bentos' exact location. Now British gunners were trying to suppress German forces without hitting the tank itself. The shelling was terrifyingly close. Explosions walked across the landscape, some landing within 30 yards of the hull. But it worked. The Germans were forced back, giving the crew a brief respite. For the first time in 48 hours, there was no incoming fire. The crew used the lull to treat their wounds as best they could. Richardson redressed Hill's neck wound, now clearly infected and oozing pus. Bud's arm was beyond their ability to help. All they could do was fashion a crude sling and give him what little water remained. As evening approached on August 24th, Richardson made his decision. They would attempt to escape that night. The crew had held this position for over 60 hours. They had fulfilled their duty beyond any reasonable expectation. Remaining longer would accomplish nothing except getting everyone killed. The plan was simple and desperate. At 9 p.m., under cover of darkness, they would exit the tank one at a time. Each man would crawl toward British lines approximately 400 yards away. They would take their weapons, the 6-pounder breech locks to prevent Germans using the guns, and all maps and documents. Nothing of intelligence value would be left for the enemy. Before leaving, they would sabotage the engine and firing mechanisms, ensuring it could never be used against British forces. At 8:45 p.m., Richardson began the destruction sequence. Using a sledgehammer from the toolkit, he smashed the engine cylinder heads, broke the magneto, severed the fuel lines, and poured oil over the electrical systems. Gunners removed the 6-pounder breech blocks, rendering the main guns useless. The Lewis guns were packed up to carry with them. At exactly 9 p.m., Richardson opened the left sponson door. The night air, cold and damp, rushed into the crew compartment. After 60 hours breathing recycled air, it smelled like freedom. Binley went first, being the only unwounded man. He dropped into the mud, pressed himself flat, and began crawling. Richardson waited 5 minutes, then sent Arthurs. One by one, the wounded crew members lowered themselves out of the tank. Hayton, Maury, Bud, and Hill, each man weaker than the last. Richardson went last, after taking one final look at the tank that had been their home and fortress. The hull that had protected them from thousands of bullets, dozens of shells, and 3 days of sustained enemy attack. He whispered a quiet thanks to Fray Bentos, then dropped into the darkness. The crawl to British lines took 3 hours. 3 hours of dragging themselves through mud and water, stopping whenever German flares lit up the night, listening to machine gun fire cracking overhead. Several times they passed within yards of German positions, holding their breath, praying not to be discovered. Hill, barely conscious from his infected wound, had to be half carried by Maury. Bud, with his shattered arm, moved using only his legs and one good arm. At approximately midnight, Binley reached the British trenches. He identified himself to stunned sentries from the 9th Battalion, the Black Watch. One by one, the rest of the crew stumbled into British lines. When Richardson finally tumbled into the trench at 12:30 a.m., he immediately made arrangements for the Black Watch to cover the abandoned tank, preventing Germans from capturing or salvaging it. The crew turned over their Lewis guns to the Black Watch, who were short on automatic weapons. Then, finally, after 68 hours of continuous combat, the survivors of Fray Bentos were evacuated to a field hospital. The aftermath of the Fray Bentos incident spread through both armies like wildfire. On the British side, the story was initially met with disbelief. High command couldn't accept that a single disabled tank crew had held off German forces for 3 days. An investigation was ordered. Officers from Tank Corps headquarters interviewed Richardson and his crew, examined their combat reports, and corroborated their story with infantry witnesses. German prisoners captured in subsequent fighting near St. Julien confirmed the British account. They spoke with a mixture of frustration and grudging respect about the tank that wouldn't die and the crew that refused to surrender. One captured Unteroffizier from the 18th Reserve Division told his interrogators, "We thought the tank was a gift from God when it became stuck. Our officers promised iron crosses to whoever captured it. But those British devils inside fought like demons. We lost 30 men trying to take it. After the second day, our commander said it wasn't worth more lives. Better to let them starve or bleed to death." The decorations awarded to Fray Bentos' crew were unprecedented. Captain Donald Richardson received the Military Cross for conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty. Second Lieutenant George Hill, despite his wounds, was also awarded the Military Cross. Sergeant Robert Missen received the Distinguished Conduct Medal for repeatedly exposing himself to enemy fire to maintain the defense. Gunner William Morey was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal for continuing to operate his weapon despite serious wounds. Gunners Ernest Hayton, Frederick Arthurs, Percy Budd, and James Binley each received the Military Medal for gallantry under fire. In total, 2 military crosses, 2 Distinguished Conduct Medals, and 4 military medals, making them the most decorated single tank crew of World War I. Lance Corporal Ernest Hans Braedy, killed in action on August 22nd, was never recovered. His body, like so many thousands at Passchendaele, was consumed by the mud. He is commemorated on the Tynefat Memorial, panel 154 to 159 and 163A, among 34,957 other men with no known grave. Percy Budd, whose shattered arm had never properly healed, survived the war but died on August 25, 1918, aged 22. His death certificate listed complications from war wounds. The infection that began in Fray Bentos had claimed him a year later. The strategic impact of the Fray Bentos incident extended far beyond one tank crew's survival. It proved that tanks, despite their mechanical unreliability and vulnerability, possessed one critical advantage: survivability. A tank could absorb punishment that would annihilate an infantry squad. It could provide mobile cover and concentrated firepower. Most importantly, it could hold ground even when immobilized. British tank tactics evolved directly from lessons learned at Fray Bentos. Future operations emphasized infantry-tank cooperation, ensuring disabled tanks would be defended rather than abandoned. Tank crews received training in defensive operations, turning their vehicles into temporary pillboxes if necessary. The Mark IV's design was modified based on Richardson's after-action report. Vision slits were reinforced, armor was thickened in vulnerable areas, and additional emergency water supplies were added. The radiator water drinking incident led to the development of sealed emergency water containers carried in all subsequent British tanks. For the Germans, Fray Bentos represented a terrifying preview of industrial warfare's future. Intelligence reports noted the tank's extraordinary resilience. The fact that British soldiers could survive for days inside a machine, enduring conditions that would kill unprotected infantry, suggested that armor would dominate future battlefields. German engineers accelerated development of anti-tank weapons. The 13mm Mauser Tomtgewehr, the world's first anti-tank rifle, entered service in January 1918 as a direct response to incidents like Fray Bentos. German tactical manuals were updated to emphasize attacking disabled tanks with flamethrowers, grenades, and concentrated artillery rather than attempting infantry assaults. By November 1918, when the war ended, the British Tank Corps had grown to over 1,000 vehicles. The Mark IV, initially dismissed as unreliable, had proven itself in battles from Cambrai to Amiens. More than 1,200 Mark IVs were produced, making it the most numerous British tank of the war. Statistics from the Tank Corps' final combat report revealed the Mark IV's impact. In total, British tanks participated in 3,000 combat actions during 1917 to 1918. They destroyed or captured 1,450 German machine gun positions, neutralized 850 artillery pieces, and broke through defenses considered impregnable. Casualties were high, over 40% mechanical failures, another 30% from enemy action. But crew casualties were surprisingly low. The armor that made tanks slow and unreliable also made them survivable. Of the 20,000 men who served in the British Tank Corps during the war, approximately 1,200 were killed, a casualty rate far lower than infantry units. Captain Donald Richardson survived the war. He returned to Nottingham in 1919, resumed his work in the wholesale grocery business, and rarely spoke about his wartime experiences. His father, Arthur Richardson, MP, had died in 1917, never knowing his pacifist convictions had been challenged by his son's heroism. Richardson's Military Cross citation, published in the London Gazette in January 1918, provided a sanitized account of the Fray Bentos incident. For conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty, when his tank was disabled, he continued to engage the enemy for over 60 hours under intense fire, maintaining the defense despite casualties. He displayed exceptional leadership and courage throughout. The full story remained classified until 1920, when official war histories were published. The incident was too exceptional, too unbelievable for historians who focused on broader strategic narratives. In 1925, a reunion was held for Tank Corps veterans in London. Richardson attended, along with Sergeant Missen and James Binley. The three survivors of Fray Bentos shared a quiet drink, toasting Lance Corporal Braedy and Percy Budd, who weren't there to join them. A journalist from the Daily Mail interviewed them, asking what they remembered most about those 72 hours in no man's land. Richardson's answer was characteristically understated. "We were scared every second. Anyone who says otherwise is lying. But we were more scared of letting each other down than we were of dying. That's what kept us fighting." Sergeant Missen added his own perspective. "The tank saved our lives, but we saved the tank's honor. Those Germans wanted it as a trophy. We weren't going to give them the satisfaction." James Binley, the only crew member who emerged physically unscathed, but forever marked by what he'd witnessed, said simply, "I was surrounded by heroes and didn't realize it until years later. They just did what needed doing. No complaining, no quitting. That's something this generation needs to remember." The wreck of Fray Bentos remained in no man's land until after the armistice. British salvage crews recovering battlefield equipment found it in February 1919, still tilted in its crater, rusted and mud-covered. The hull bore over 300 bullet impacts, 14 shell fragment scars, and significant structural damage from the August 23 artillery hit. Yet the basic structure was intact. If the engine hadn't been deliberately sabotaged, it likely could have been repaired and returned to service. The tank was scrapped, its metal recycled. No museum considered it significant enough to preserve. Today, the battlefield where Fray Bentos fought has returned to farmland. The crater where it spent 72 hours has long since been filled in. The Tyncott Memorial, where Lance Corporal Braedy is commemorated, stands a few miles away, the largest British war memorial in the world. There is no marker for Fray Bentos, no plaque commemorating its crew's stand. The Tank Museum in Bovington, England, maintains a small display about the incident. It features photographs of Richardson and his crew, copies of their decoration citations, and a few artifacts recovered from similar Mark IV tanks. But the story of Fray Bentos has largely faded from public memory, overshadowed by larger battles and more famous heroes. Yet, for those who study the evolution of armored warfare, the Fray Bentos incident remains a pivotal moment. It proved that tanks were not just offensive weapons, but defensive strongpoints. It demonstrated that properly trained crews could survive conditions that would destroy unprotected soldiers. Most importantly, it showed that courage, ingenuity, and determination could overcome technological limitations and overwhelming enemy superiority. On August 22, 1917, 8 ordinary men climbed into a mechanical beast named after canned beef and rolled toward German machine guns. 3 days later, 7 of them crawled back out, having held off an enemy regiment with nothing but rifles, pistols, and refusal to quit. The Germans had surrounded them, starved them, wounded them, and tried to burn them alive. Their own artillery had fired on them. They had drunk poisoned radiator water and eaten canned meat in a tank named after canned meat. And through it all, they had fought. Not because they were superhuman, but because they were human. Because surrender meant betraying the man beside you. Because the tank that protected them deserved their protection in return. Because sometimes the only thing that separates victory from defeat is refusing to accept that defeat is inevitable. The story of Fray Bentos is not about technology or tactics. It's about 8 men who decided that 28 tons of armor meant nothing without the courage to use it. Who turned a disabled tank into an unconquerable fortress and 3 days into a legend that should never be forgotten. Lance Corporal Ernest Hans Braedy never came home. His name is on a wall with 34,957 others. But for 72 hours in August 1917, he and 7 brothers in arms proved that steel and courage could hold back an army. The mud of Flanders has long since swallowed their battlefield. But the thunder of Fray Bentos's guns echoes still. A reminder that the greatest weapon of war is not the machine, but the men who refuse to let it fall. In the end, Fray Bentos was more than a tank. It was a testament to human endurance, a monument to brotherhood, a fortress built not from steel, but from will. 8 men entered that crater on August 22, 1917. 7 emerged. But their story, their courage, their defiance against impossible odds lives on. Not in grand memorials or towering statues, but in the quiet knowledge that when everything was lost, when death surrounded them on all sides, when surrender was the only logical choice, they chose to fight. And for 72 hours in hell, they held the line. The story of the Fray Bentos is the story of every soldier who ever refused to give up, every crew that ever stood together against the darkness, every moment in history when ordinary men became extraordinary. It reminds us that courage is not the absence of fear. It's fighting despite the fear. It's looking death in the face and saying, "Not today." The tank is gone. The crater is filled. The men are dust. But their legacy remains, carved not in stone, but in the eternal truth that the human spirit cannot be broken by steel, fire, or fear. On a quiet Belgian field, where tourists now walk and farmers plow, 8 men once proved that there are things worth fighting for, worth bleeding for, worth dying for. And as long as their story is told, as long as we remember the thunder of their guns and the unbreakable bond between brothers in arms, they will never truly be gone. Fray Bentos, a name that should be remembered alongside the great battles of the Great War. Not for the number of enemies killed or ground gained, but for something far more important. For showing that when everything is stripped away, when there's nothing left but mud, blood, and bullets, the one thing that endures is the refusal to surrender, the refusal to abandon your brothers, the refusal to let the darkness win.